All right, now we're actually live. So last time we edited string, and so I don't know who was in the room last time, but basically, so disregard the div. The div is buggy. The reason the div is buggy is because the way we do the diffing is by basically aligning the API by their ID, ignoring effectively things that are not contributing to the ID. And then once we have them, we basically generate the tokens for both sides and we do a token-based div. However, when Santi added the capability to emit question marks, the problem is that on the left-hand side, you can't see this here, but basically the char bracket is a single token, and then the char opening bracket, closing bracket question marks of 4 different tokens, and that's why they always show up as a div, even though they haven't changed sometimes. So the div is basically not.
I mean, the question mark was added.
Yes, so
the
this one
could be smarter and it could show just an addition of a question mark.
No, the problem today is that nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed.
So let's say it would still be char bracket, it will still show up as a div because the old one had a single token, the new one has 3 tokens. So that's why the div is usually not useful.
But what do you mean nothing has changed?
So not in this example
was
here.
Added.
Not in this example here, but basically the way that the tokens are now emitted is different from the old one.
Okay.
And so like there's some cases where you get, spurious diff. So treat everything as a.
But also, something separate from that, we should be looking at everything, not just things changed.
Correct. In fact, let me actually do this. I can actually, I don't have to pretend. If only this was a tool that you can actually swap the sides and stuff.
Yeah, I'm hearing this bug very often. This is literally, this bug has been there for like a year.
That is probably true.
Who's working on this tool?
I can tell you that. Nobody. It is. There's no bugs. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I know what the bug is. It's unfortunately not that easy to fix. As it is with almost all bugs. All right. String comparison. Here we go.
Can you hide enums?
I cannot. That looks reasonable. Time span, don't think has anything reference types on it.
Actually, there's parse exactly. There's formats.
Yeah, but those are just the standard ones that go with my interface.
Yeah.
Well, is the toString with a format from an interface?
Well, it's technically not part of iFormat provider, but it's always implemented in conjunction with.
Yeah, this looks similar to what we had earlier. Actually, let me pull up my notes that I have from last time. Yeah, so we said iPhone provider should basically always be nullable, right? So that's, I think, the case here.
Right, because everything operates on null being default.
Yep.
We allow formats here to be null rather than empty for the array.
We do for the try ones. Say that's not the intent. You're not supposed to pass in, but you just return false in cases. It's just for the non-try, for parse, we throw.
What do we throw for? We probably throw an argument exception, no?
We throw a format exception.
Okay, that's odd. Because those seem like you're using the API incorrectly, right?
Yeah, I would expect you to either pass in an empty format or an actual array.
I mean, it's a question of, do we want this to reflect what people may have already been doing and be lenient, or do we want it to reflect sort of the stringent requirements that we intend for the API, whether or not we respect that or not?
Yeah. So I think in this case, though, I think the caller doesn't get what they think they're getting, right?
Right. I would think if you're passing in null formats that you're potentially doing something wrong or not doing what you think you're doing. I don't think it's a common case to probably pass in null here.
Yeah, I mean, what would the case be? Basically, you would have to.
But this would be the same as inputs, right? I mean, somebody passing null from input.
No, but usually your input string comes from either the user or the data file you're processing, right? Versus the format is something you just know intrinsically.
Because like empty string we treat as default in most of these cases.
And since it's try, it would just be a burden on the user to say, "Oh, we can handle the null input for you, and return, and it's try." So we'll be careful about it, as opposed to they have to check for null and then call our API. Otherwise, they'll get a format, which itself is doing more checking. But the formats seem.
It's like, would passing null be basically a bug that you want to fix in your software?
Well, I mean, if
The
you're
answer is yes, it probably shouldn't be.
yeah, because if you're passing null, we're just going to say the parsing fails 100% of the time. So it's basically a case of if you're passing a null, you're probably not passing the right things because you were expecting to parse that result. So we could still accept null and like internally return false, but the API should probably say you shouldn't pass null here.
Still, I would say if we were designing the API from scratch, we shouldn't accept probably nulls in format. Because the try boolean basically means the data was, the data is invalid. It's not that the usage of the API is invalid.
Right, in the design guidelines, don't they say
don't have
multiple.
Two error conditions should not result in one boolean.
If the data is completely invalid, still like throw, but
yeah. So are you saying we want to change this across? Like we've already reviewed APIs where we allowed format to be null.
Yeah, we should be consistent.
We want to go back across all of those, like GUID, time span, date time.
I think that
all of the formats should be not allowed to be null.
Yes, I think that's what we're saying.
At the API level, we're not going to change it.
Right. Do we have multiple APIs that take an array of format strings?
Can you try parse exact? The time can time also.
Yeah, I think it's just the date time related ones.
Right.
And that just means, try any of them?
Yeah.
It's funny that the method is called try parse exact, and then you can pass an alternative format.
Yeah. But I tell you exactly what to do. Follow this list of 4 alternatives. You can either eat pizza or you can eat vegetables.
I think it makes sense. I mean, in comparison to try parse, use any possible format versus exactly the ones that I've specified.
Sure.
What about the input being nullable on try parse stack?
I think that one has to stay allowing null.
Again, that one seems fine because it's the user's getting a string from somewhere and they're saying, please try to parse this. And they would either have to check for null beforehand in a separate if case just above it before they do the if on the try parse exact.
And the error handling will be exactly the same as the try parse exact returns false. So.
But you could say the boolean is about the data being invalid, not somebody not providing any data. And the argument of users having to check on the call side, I mean, that could be applied for to any parameter that is a reference type, correct?
Right, it just becomes a XX and try parse.
I guess that's true. It just feels like because the name is try parse, it's going to try for me, and if it's not valid for any number of reasons.
But as I said, I mean, technically, I think in the spirit of the pattern was that the data comes from something, and I don't know what the data contains. I try to parse it, and it may fail. If I have a null, then, well, I don't have data. It's not that it's invalid. Having said that, I think we basically have lots of APIs that return null strings for various reasons. And then you chain them. And then,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I interrupted you.
I was just basically saying, because we already have APIs that return null strings.
But we don't have APIs return null for date formatting or any formatting like this.
No, it's the input. Format we already.
What I'm saying is like, usually people will parse that dates that get formatted before from a source that get formatted before. So null is not going to be one of those things.
Okay, let me try to think about APIs that return nulls as strings.
While you're thinking about it, though, it's important to keep in mind that this isn't. We're only talking about things that the compiler can compare, right? So, if we don't have a question mark here, the compiler will warn you most of the time if you have a string question mark somewhere and you try and pass it in.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a downside to removing the question mark in that we will likely be introducing more warnings to the code. Now, you could argue those warnings are helpful. You could also argue those warnings are just onerous and unnecessary.
Yeah, I think in this case the behavior is well defined, right? Like as in, I call an API, I give it a piece of data to validate, and if it's not valid, it returns false. Like I really don't see why I would ever write code where I would differ based on whether it's null or whether it's invalid data. So I would always write the same error code, so I might as well just accept null.
But does this apply to the formats too?
No, I think the formats to me are different because, as I said, the formats are usually intrinsic to the API, right? It's like to the usage side. Like I have a hard time seeing somebody getting the format from some external data source. Like I would say most of the time, like you pick the format.
Not true. I mean, I saw many people about like if you format a date to specific format, so when you parse it, you got the same format you used. So you will get both from the same source.
But is a null a valid value for a format? Like, I understand you would have like a table or you would remember the format. Like,
this is my original argument about like, if we think that format cannot be null, so I will think that the input will not be null too. Because like, if you format date with some format, so you have both all the time. You will not have one null and one is not null.
By the way, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I
understand what Steven said about like, yeah, if we remove the question mark, it will generate a lot of warnings, which is the very bad experience for the user then.
Well, it will generate lots of warnings if we think that people would have nullable strings that they want to pass in here.
Right, because like if you're getting input from a user, it's not going to be null, it's going to be empty string.
Exactly, and then you have an instance of string, and then if this didn't have a question mark, it would just work. But
again, it doesn't matter whether it's null versus an empty string. It matters what the type of the variable is.
Yeah.
Right.
So like, let's talk about concrete examples. Like when you would use this API, you probably got the string. Either you read it directly, or you split it. Probably you split it because our parsing APIs require the string passed in to be exact token that can be parsed. They are not like the new UTF-8 APIs that kind of parse as much as they can. So you probably got it from string that split. And if string that split returns non-nullable strings, then you would.
Let's take another example. Let's say I had a file that was just a bunch of dates, one per line. and I'm using streamReader.readLine. ReadLine returns string question mark because it turns null when there are no more lines to read. So if you were calling try parse exact on each line, it might not be the best coding style, but I could totally imagine a loop that was while try parse exact stream.readLine.
But then you basically, maybe, but realistically, if I was writing this parser, I would want to know that I'm at the end of the file versus one of the lines was an invalid string, so my try parse returned false, and then I exited the loop.
As a thoughtful programmer, yes. You would.
The thoughtful program.
I mean, I've totally written quick and dirty, I need to fix up some data scripts, right? That will just read line until some try method returns false, because I don't particularly care. And if my output is wrong, I'll fix it later, right? I'm only using the script for 10 minutes.
Yeah, but you probably also will be enabling nullable for that script.
I would. But
Well, eventually we'll be on by default, right? So we should optimize for that case too. So would you opt out for these scripts? Probably not.
Well, I mean, scripts generally don't run through. I guess it depends.
I did not mean like CSI. I meant like new console app.
Yeah. .NET new console.
I'm sure
That's my
most of
script.
the people would use whatever is the default. So.
Exactly. That would be my guess too. Which for now it's off, but eventually we want to turn it on. So we should make sure that it works well. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I don't feel super strongly about the format strings. It just feels odd to allow them to be null. I feel much stronger about the input string because like this one I can see being just annoying.
I assume removing these annotations. Is there a breaking change either way?
So the general spirit is we will allow breaking changes in these annotations between now and 5.0, probably more than we will do post 5.0, because this is the first time we roll them out. We probably get them wrong in some places.
And breaking changes in both directions you consider breaking, or just one direction?
No.
Adding is a breaking change, or removing is a breaking change?
Generally speaking, adding a question mark is
Depends on whether it's
It's
in or
not.
out.
I think it's breaking for the output.
yes.
I see, yes.
It's like
It depends
covariance
on
rules.
the in or out position. Yeah, that's true.
And with virtuals it gets more complicated, but yeah.
I see. So basically, adding on output is a breaking change. Removing on input is not a breaking change.
Unless it's a virtual.
Adding on the input would be.
Right.
Really? Because then I cannot take the output that I produced and pass it to a method that says I don't want any nulls.
Right. If I have a string question mark variable and I pass that to something that takes a string, I will get a warning. If I pass it to something that takes a string question mark, I won't.
So adding on the input is not a breaking change, except that it will break anything that implements you.
Right. There's the virtual or delegate binding or any of those things. There are another set of rules.
When you consider delegates, anything you do with annotation breaking somewhere.
Yeah, I think in practice you probably like messing with them one way or the other will probably cause some.
Yeah, because to me, you don't have to implement it. I mean, return type is just like a local variable that Steve was talking about, which basically means if I just chain calls and suddenly we have question mark, but the input does not accept question marks, then my code gets a warning and potentially it's broken. So it seems like either way it's breaking.
Yeah, if you consider how code flows, yes.
That is the point of nullable.
Yeah. Right, so what's the decision now? Are we saying we accept the question marks on both sides, just one side? Neither side?
I think we should continue to accept null inputs, nullable inputs. I'm fine with removing the question marks from the try parse formats.
So my opinion, like, since we can relax it in the future, and like that's not gonna cause any issues, we can as well start with non-nullable and then relax it to give any with backup.
Yeah, I think that might.
I don't feel strongly.
I think that might be the safer option as well.
Again, you can't just do that without understanding that it will cause some breaks, but I think it's the lesser set of breaks.
Yeah.
In this specific case, what would it break to go from string input to string question mark input?
Any delegates that you capture.
Any
Now,
delegates that you capture?
well, any time that you like take this as a delegate.
Why, oh, with delegate nullable covariance, why would I should be able to have a delegate that takes a string? And
Right. No.
modifies something
Yeah.
that takes-
This isn't changing a delegate type, actually, is it?
Well, it's if you have a nullable delegate and you assign it a non-nullable method.
Yeah, but I can't do that.
You can't do that.
Right. It gives you a warning.
Right. That would. But it,
No,
that would
I was thinking. I was thinking the other
direction.
direction. I was thinking the other direction, Stephen.
Well, we also won't get input other than maybe some people complaining that their own inputs aren't null if we make these nullable by default. Actually, I don't even think we get any real feedback in that case either because people won't see warnings. Whereas if we don't have the nullable annotations, people might complain, in which case we could then know we should add them.
So what is I would generally say if you mark this thing as nullable, then I think we will not get feedback. I think the only way we get feedback is if we basically cause warnings to begin with.
Yeah.
In which case I would say like on input I think we all kind of agree that you will probably get warnings that we don't want. So probably input I think we agree that it should be question mark, and then format is more I think the debate. I would start with making it not null and then see who complains.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm not sure I agree that the inputs will be null, but I'm fine with letting it be nullable.
Alright, so then time zone.
There are no references.
Emo, you're taking notes on this, right? Because we're gonna have to go back.
Yeah,
and
I
scrub
do.
the out-
Yes.
Okay.
So what happens if I construct a time zone using the create method and pass in a null display name? I get empty string.
I think that it will default something, but I'm almost sure it will default. Because we pass the ID, right?
Yeah.
No, we pass the ID, so we can technically speaking read the.
The ID
what the
has to
correct-
be not nullable.
Yeah, and since we have the ID, we can read whatever the OS provided. I'm almost sure this was defaulting to whatever OS.
It does seem really weird that we accept a nullable display. We don't return a nullable
But
display.
the null would signify the default in that case,
Okay.
which
But
almost sure that
Right, it's the case of you
Okay.
can't have default string empty, so you have to default to null.
Right.
We return empty. That's what we do. Which I think is generally not bad. Like I think in general there's nothing wrong with allowing something to be nullable in the input but not returning nullable on the output. That seems not necessarily bad. So find system time zone by ID never returns a null.
No,
Even if it
I
doesn't.
think it's raw. Didn't find.
That seems a bit weird given the API name.
Yeah, it throws if it can't find something successfully.
Is there a try find later on?
It actually does flow, yeah, you're right.
No, there is no try.
It says if the time zone is
Better be
invalid,
right.
it says invalid time zone.
In next version of C# we need exception annotations.
Bring that up next time. Check exceptions. See what Mads thinks.
I'll bring it up when Anders is not.
Make sure that can also be nullable for shits and giggles.
When we do that, Christoph, you get to annotate Corliss.
Well, that can be done automatically, correct? I just scan for exceptions.
Every time a sentence starts with this can be automated, the answer is probably going to be no.
I didn't say that it can reliably be automated.
Shall be like too similar to Java at that point.
You just don't. Anyway, that's not what
I think it's the one thing which was like super annoying for me in Java.
Just one thing.
I don't like it in general, but that is like particularly annoying.
Why can you pass null message to exceptions?
So you get a default message.
An error occurred of
Then why
type.
would you not call the default constructor?
Because we don't have one.
I see it's there. Timezone not found exception
Oh.
default constructor.
No, with an inner exception.
You want the default message, but line inner exception.
I see. Then what about the constructor that doesn't take inner exception?
Well, then there's a consistency argument.
Right. It's fine. It's fine. I was just we are establishing here like patterns how we're
Yes.
gonna think about these things.
One thing, I as we're reviewing all this stuff, Emo, you've asked a few times about return argument. That's one case where the compiler, as we've been annotating, it would have put that in our face if it didn't annotate a return value as being nullable, and it was possible that it could have returned null. The only way that could have happened is if we explicitly suppressed something.
Right.
And so it's hopefully it should be relatively rare that we find mistakes on return values that that we have not annotated to be nullable, but that should be. The opposite might happen, probably. Right, it's possible we were over aggressive in annotating return values as nullable, but they didn't have to be.
Right. You don't think you banged something away likely?
I have a question.
Well, we certainly could have, but it's just we were pretty diligent, or at least we tried to be diligent about and thoughtful about every time we put an exclamation point, which was a lot.
Eric,
Sorry, you were gonna.
No, I was going to wonder about other issue about like the operators like equal and not equal. What do we have like guidelines? We should use nullable or not?
I think it was nullable for all.
No, this is not nullable.
It might be a
Yeah,
struct.
it's a struct.
Yeah.
Typically structs can't be null.
Position time is the struct.
Except for nullable struct.
But all of the operator equal or not equal, static equal methods, they all allow reference types, they allow null.
Yeah.
What about the serialization APIs?
The protected or private deconstructors.
Yes.
They are
Callers of those are so first the serialization is type, and pretty much every exception requires those. Pretty much anything that gets deserialized expects it to be non-null or it'll null that. The only caller is generally binary formatter itself, which always passes it null. But from an annotation perspective, non-nullable. If you pass in a null,
Okay.
Yeah, so that seems fine. Then, alright, tuples, I don't think there's much to do.
yeah, the nice thing about generics from a perspective is you have to pay attention.
It can be whatever.
Yeah, Let's go over all these tuples. I think they're all the same.
They can be whatever. What does it mean? We don't apply ever the annotations to generics,
You
correct?
can't.
So for unconstrained generics, the consumer gets to supply the type arguments. So with a tuple T1, someone could construct a tuple string or a tuple string, which means the implementer of the type has to assume that every incoming generic, unconstrained generic, might be null, and every outgoing unconstrained generic can't be null.
Yeah.
For fun implementation. That gets relaxed a little bit with the attributes that are being worked on now by the compiler team. That you can kind of override that by saying with attributes, null is allowed here even if the generic type argument is non-nullable and vice versa.
Okay, cool.
So type is pretty hard. Booyah did a lot of work on this to figure out like what could be null and what couldn't be null, and it's complicated by the fact that it's abstract and there's a bunch of implementations. But this is one of those types where we largely assumed that all the implementations were ours, and so we weren't particularly concerned about some devious type derived type turning null from something that none of our types return.
Under what case could you actually get a null full name?
This one I think was actually documented.
Yeah, this is going to be annoying.
Yeah, null if the current instance represents a generic type parameter, an array type, a pointer type, or a biref type.
I assume it's similar for qualified name, assembly qualified name.
Probably.
Because something about signatures as well.
Where's the name? Oh, name is
Signature
on
type or
number.
something.
Yeah, here you go.
You look at that one. Assembly qualified name.
Well, presumably the same case as with the other one, doesn't have a full name.
Yeah, null if the current instance represents a generic type parameter.
Yeah, method base makes sense. Base type makes sense. String type makes sense. Pools.
Namespace.
Yeah, same reasons, I guess.
Yeah, I think if you declare a type that doesn't have a namespace, I believe it returns. Like if it's just top level.
Right.
Yeah, null if the current instance has no namespace or represents a generic parameter.
So the filter in defined interfaces, like it's non-nullable, but the filter in the find members is nullable, which is kind of weird.
Or what?
The defined interfaces and find members look at the filter.
That one's not nullable. The one below it, member filters.
It's like inconsistent. There's a button there.
There's a little bit.
So that matches the implementation. I mean, both of them match the implementation. Find interface is the first thing it does is it throws a filter as null. Find members, if the filter is null, it doesn't run the filter. It pretends like it allows everything through.
And actually, now that I think about it, I think that any reflection code that I've seen online of like, oh, here's how you go find these things has usually has null for the member filter.
That's right.
Because usually the binding flags is enough to figure it out, and the name.
I don't know why find interfaces didn't allow it, but it does not.
What is filter criteria?
Sorry, where are you looking? Oh, at the end there?
Yeah.
No,
Some arbitrary data that you get passed back?
it's arbitrary object state that gets passed to member filter.
So it's you normally would call this state or something.
Well,
right?
then why is it non-nullable and find
Disclosure.
numbers?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that
I
should.
think that should probably be object question mark, and member filter should probably be defined to take. Yeah, member filter should be defined to take object question mark instead of object.
And why is it non-nullable or in find interfaces as well? Are we going to change both to be nullable?
Seems like
Probably.
it should.
Yeah.
I don't have any state to pass.
So what was the
Yeah,
last thing you said? Ken?
this wouldn't have shown up in our analysis. I don't think we call these anywhere in correlate.
Both filter criteria. The
Yeah.
one for
Should be
find
null, yeah.
interfaces as well.
Okay, array range. These APIs are so ugly. I have to say.
And there are so many of them.
Yes.
Get enum name returns a string, but get enum names returns a non-nullable array of strings.
That's actually pretty common. We can double check those, but it's pretty common to see in the reflection APIs things that return a collection just return an empty collection, and things that return a string return null.
Okay.
Yeah, we generally avoid null collections because they're like
Except with the others.
they already have a predefined value, and you can easily single that one.
Get constructor implementation cannot accept null for types.
Yep, I think you have to pass it an empty array if you want the parameter-based constructor.
It is protected though, so
And then get generic type definition should it be return nullable?
Did you see that?
Get generic type definition.
What was the question?
If it should return nullable.
Yeah, what does it do when you're not on the generic instance? It just returns itself.
This one is overridden in like 70 bazillion places. It looks like it often either throws or returns itself. Most of the implementations I see, like on runtime type, it says if this is not a generic type, throw in a valid operation exception.
Got it.
Makes sense.
That makes sense, actually. Yeah.
But that's an example where, like, someone could implement their own type model and derive from these things and return null, but we're sort of waving our hands at that and saying, well, that's not the 99.9% case, and it's not the intent, so we're going to annotate the API with the intent.
It's also problematic, right? Because you really can't have I mean, on one hand side, you can't have it both ways. Right? You can't treat a reflection as this abstract object model I can code against, not knowing whether I, look at the runtime types or the, something from metadata, and then have inconsistencies on these levels, right? In that sense, I don't think that's a minus, that's a plus. Somebody's going to get a squiggle when they return null.
So the interface mapping we passed over, 5 above, is the one I mentioned last time.
Yeah.
Get interface map, where I will probably come to it, but interface mapping is just a struct with, I think, 4 strings in it, or 4 reference fields in it, and we've made those all non-nullable, even though technically they could be, but the only way you get them in general is through this function decided to make them non-nullable.
Yeah. It's
So
unfortunate.
if it doesn't exist, if that it will just throw.
Which is not real.
I believe. Oh, that's a good question. What is it?
Or if you pass in a class or some other type that's not an interface.
Which one? You mean this one here?
No, that one, yeah.
Yeah, I think it also will.
And then get method
Yeah,
does
if
not throw.
there's nothing to return, it throws.
Okay.
So yeah, this exercise is highlighting how we are already inconsistent. Like on the other hand, get method when you pass a name that doesn't exist doesn't throw, just returns null.
Yep.
Well, I mean, there's always an interface map. It might be that there aren't any interfaces. So this might return you a struct that contains empty arrays. Basically, it'll throw if the type provided is generic parameter or null.
Oh, so if I specify a type that is actually not implemented on the type, then it will still give me back an empty interface.
I'm just looking through the.
I
It
thought it
looks
would've
like that's
thrown,
what's
yeah.
happening. Although there's a bunch of places where we call helpers and I'm not tracking them through. But we get down to a place where basically we initialize the interface mapping with the type, this, 2 arrays of length, instance method count.
Right.
Just scroll over for the get method.
Yeah, so the origin.
Yeah, and get method. The types array cannot be null.
Yeah, I think in reflection that's generally the case. Every single time you pass in the argument types, you have to make it empty if you really want the empty one.
Except for
Yeah,
parameter modifiers.
Yeah.
And types in get method input.
As I said,
But
reflection
types
is
in other APIs, yeah, you cannot pass null.
Well, the method impl is protected, right? So, because I assume that all of these things just call get method impl and just pass along
Yes.
whatever they
For
have
me,
or null.
The interesting question for me is like, how do you get through reflection? How do you get the data about the nullability itself? So like, how does it interact?
Well, here's the real question: how do you end up with these methods when you design this API? How did you get to this state? Oh boy.
Maybe the annotation should just be a wiki,
Wiki.
so people can tweak it over time.
And it's basically just one line. It says, "We tried."
She'll be asking us to put shruggy emoticons in the error messages.
So I was just looking at the docs.
Seems like we missed one of the return types.
So which one?
Property info,
Yeah,
got property.
Property.
Lower. Lower. Or more. Here.
That one. Type should be nullable.
Which one should we know?
This.
Type, return type.
Why is return
null.
type nullable here?
It is nullable for all other overrides of that API.
Why would you call this?
It can't be null. It throws if it's.
Why would you call this one instead of the name if you're passing a nullable type?
Basic consistency. Like in the general design, like if you would design the API from scratch, this would be nullable.
It should be. You can change it, right?
You'd have
I
it,
guess
or you'd have it as like a default parameter or something.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you would collapse everything down to just this one, right? And you would just default them all to null. But
So the logic here is if we're going to call it with just a return type of null, you would just call get property name instead. But if you want to be able to specify types or modifiers, you're forced to provide a return type, and therefore we allow it to be null.
I think that's how we got here. But that's the same thing with exception, right? But we didn't make the overload that just takes message nullable, right? We just said, oh, this is also nullable.
For what it's worth, I was looking at the parameter modifier docs, and apparently the parameter modifier objects are only used when using commenter op. And it explicitly says the default binder ignores it.
So we've spent a lot of time on system type. Is it worth it? Like,
But to me, it's more about finding, like as you said, like the case law for like
Just
what,
the case,
what,
okay,
what,
so
okay.
actually,
what,
I do
what
have-
kind of patterns do we
I
want
do
to
have
have?
another question though. So we have the one that takes name, return type, and types. If you were going to pass a nullable return type, why wouldn't you call the overload that doesn't require you to pass a return type?
That's a good question. I didn't
Right.
see
If we're using that argument for the return type, for the name and the return type, we should use that same argument there.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess we wouldn't change the implementation. We could
Right.
potentially strip the, oh, but there isn't one that takes modifiers.
There is not one that takes modifiers.
So what
Like
was,
your argument. Yeah. So there'd be no, if you wanted to call, and apparently modifiers is common or by the default binder, but if you did want to pass name and modifiers and not a return type or types, you'd have a way to do it if we made that overload take a null return type. Or we could potentially do it for the one above the line that's highlighted.
Just feels like we should try and be consistent with our reasoning in overloads of the same method.
Consistency.
I mean, we should. It's
I'm
probably
kidding.
the problem with,
I-
with reflection though is like it's like you try to make one thing more consistent, but at the expense of making something else less consistent. So
If
pick
we're-
your battle.
So
Freaking-
get property implementation takes nullable types, while get method implementation doesn't take nullable types.
That's the same with the whole pattern reflection, right? You always have one worker method, the info,
But
where
it's
everything is
really
nullable, and then you have the actual APIs where things are not nullable. That's just how the API works. But yeah, it's an odd pattern.
I mean, for things like this, my guess is I have to look at the implementation. My guess is types here ends up being word. I don't know. Look, type.get.
It probably is.
Oh no, it's just explicit. I mean, it's explicitly checked. If types equals null or types.length, so it treats them this.
I feel like I need a wine after
That ends
this.
up being because the implementation of things like get property that doesn't take a types passes no get property.
Of course it does.
so it makes sense. So we are now discussing, and there are pros and cons, and some things are inconsistent. It seems to me like it's more important to annotate the outputs correctly. And inputs, we basically would start with it accepts null unless we know that it throws an exception. Is that
I feel like that's
I mean,
not as
that's kind of what we did.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, to be clear, this is not somebody guessing question marks, right? This is somebody actually put an implementation and have the code compile. So, like, as far as the compiler is concerned, this is a consistent worldview. The question is just, is that a worldview that we like? Like, we basically documented what the code does at this point, but I think part of the review is, does that make sense? Right? Because before that, we could never see nullable information in the API, right? You would have to look at what the method actually throws.
yeah?
I think
What I
the
was saying,
point- yeah.
sometimes we like. I know that the implementation, like let's say the array that type is not nullable, or any one of those that input parameters are not nullable. We could make them nullable as
Right.
long as they don't throw. And since they take non-nullable parameter right now, they apparently don't throw.
if
Oh,
they
no,
take non-nullable, it's likely because they throw.
because they throw.
Yeah.
We largely defaulted to saying, Christoph, at least that's what we tried to do, is have the parameters express what was allowed, because we kind of wanted to minimize unnecessary warning. So inputs would be as they would allow as much as possible, and outputs would be as constrained as possible.
Yeah.
To be as and be as accurate as we could. That said, it's a little bit harder. I think we will find we made more mistakes on input, because when we turn on the nullable feature, everything that was currently written with reference types automatically becomes non-nullable. And we would go and review every single method to figure out if we did we should have a question mark added, but effectively it defaulted to no question mark. We had to go add question marks everywhere we thought they were warranted. So we probably missed. But to the earlier conversation, for inputs, if in that direction we're benefiting, because we could change, in the majority of cases, we could change a non-nullable and have it be non-breaking. But I am 100% certain, as this review has already shown, that we made some mistakes. Just trying to minimize.
Yeah. Man, that font is glorious.
You don't like the question mark, angle bracket question mark?
No, this reminds me of why I didn't like C++.
Oof.
Question mark larger than question mark.
Imagine if we designed all these types from scratch, we could just say nothing's null.
And what if it's an array of generic type within a generic type?
Generally speaking, or generically speaking?
And it's a reference type, so you can have items nullable and array nullable.
Yeah.
Yeah, we end up with a lot of object question mark, open bracket, close bracket, question mark.
Oh, some beautiful COM APIs in the middle.
Well, it's not as bad as the TSC annotations in M#.
Get type from class ID. I mean, I'm assuming that maybe it doesn't actually matter, but why do we have the version that takes the server take a nullable server, and we have the when you would just call with a single GUID? You didn't intend on passing a value there?
Probably because the root one calls the server one and passes in null.
What I'm curious about is get type from class ID throw an error. So presumably, like if it doesn't throw, it returns null. So
You'd think that. No, it returns the magic type that indicates missing, apparently.
I see.
Okay.
So speaking about the null objects in arrays,
It's one of those errors.
when you call invoke member, how since there will be some APIs that take null parameters, how do I pass null parameter? Unless I misunderstand the syntax, because now it says I can pass a null array, but I cannot pass an array with null values.
Yeah, that should be object question mark.
Yeah.
Brace close brace question mark. Pretty much everything involving reflection has to assume nullable in, nullable out. That's a good catch.
All right, so let me just write this up. So you said it's this one here, right? The object args.
On
should
the
be
two
object
lines, the ones
question.
highlighted in one of them.
Close, open, close,
Open,
question
close.
marks.
Take object.
My guess is there are other cases of other invoke stuff for reflection.
Yeah, and I just checked. Like, I don't understand. Like to Christopher's point, I don't understand the throw-on error thing, because type.missing is an object. So what do we return here when we can't find this thing?
Or get type from prog ID.
Well, class ID, where we say throw-on error false. Clearly, we need to return something.
Type the dummy.
Probably the same.
I have no idea. It's implemented in the runtime. We'd have to go look at the native code. It's possible it returns null in the nullable. Try and go dig into the native code.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Or it returns unknown type. I unknown. It probably returns I unknown.
Type not found type.
All right. Let's try to finish type.
Or only on I. Oh, there's not anything after I. Okay. That's good.
This assignable from takes a nullable type, really?
Yeah, so it is nullable. I just opened CSI and passed in throw on error false. Easiest way to check for runtime implementation.
You just run it.
Is instance of type text nullable?
And the reflection only get type throw if not found. It should probably return nullable.
Yeah, like these don't make sense to me. Like assignable from nullable type, really?
Oh.
Physical then two nullable type.
Does
I
that
guess
let you check if it's a reference type? Is that just a fancy way
I
of
mean,
doing
I
this?
just did
No,
type
no, no.
event
You
study
check if
on
it's
it,
nullable.
null, and it returned false.
I guess the question is whether or not, like, what the API usage pattern would be, because where would you get that type from? You might get that type from just calling one of the other get type members, which returns potentially null, I think. So if you called that and then pass it to this, then maybe?
Yeah, this API just starts out with
So,
if C is
yeah.
null, return false.
Also throw on there.
This is
there's
probably a
a throw
case
if
where
not
we
found.
should have thrown and had a try.
Just
Yeah.
What do you see
grabbing
there?
the last one. Almost the last one.
Reflection
Second from
only
the
get
last.
type.
Yeah, I think they get type from reflection only. Type. All right.
Did we talk about the is assignable from taking a nullable type or the instances of type taking a nullable object?
Well, well, the problem with type is assignable from is it's the reverse thing, right? You ask for the type on the left-hand side. So clearly, it almost must be a type. Passing in null makes no sense.
Yeah,
Well, right. So but it takes a nullable type.
I know, but like Steven said, it returns false today. So we can either decide to,
break the API to no longer take null and throw.
but
I mean, so, but like, for example, reflection only get type turns a nullable type. Right? We need to fix that. So if you then wrote is assignable from reflection only get type,
Right.
now you're going to get a warning.
Okay.
It's interesting how it's assignable from the type parameter. I mean, the parameter name is C.
Class? I have no idea.
Maybe it was
Yeah,
supposed to be O and the type was.
but it's also, why would you
That
design the
happened to me
API
with
like
the
that?
finger was on the keyboard.
Like if you read source code, it's reversed. You want to ask the other way around. Like this API is so bad. It's like, and there are many cases like this in reflection where it's like, yeah, you could do it like that. All
Or
right.
we should create a new .NET where we fix all the API.
Oh, let me tell you about reflection when we fix reflection.
We remove it.
Call it .NET Core.
.NET kernel.
Well, now that we renamed .NET Core to .NET 5, we can start over.
And the name only we could love.
You know, that's your April 1st joke next year. Proposed now .NET 5 Core.
Sorry, there's a problem with the reception. I think the live stream
And
is
wait till
breaking
you
up.
get fired.
.NET polish.
All right, friends. We'll see you next week.
Sounds compatible. So.
So it's